Daredevil is a Marvel character that always fascinated me. In a lot of ways, he's Marvel's Batman, and I know there's a more direct comparison like Moon Knight out there, but he's the street-level character with tons of knowledge, detective skills, and he's pretty popular. So when Netflix announced the series, I thought it'd be cool, but kind of didn't know what to expect. Would it be a censored step down in quality as DC's CW Arrowverse was, or more in the vein of a Marvel Studios presentation, compounded in confusion when the show was announced to be part of said Marvel Cinematic Universe? Anyways, I watched it as a teenager and enjoyed the mix of superhero action and premium television content, all of The Sopranos, Mad Men, or that kind of thing. It was well done and was trying to be kind of a crime drama with some superhero elements, which I thought was a good way to kind of balance the budget and spectacle for this TV presentation in the years before spending film budgets on streaming TV was kind of the norm, as it is today. After Netflix signed on to host and pay for the Defenders saga, Drew Goddard was set to be the showrunner for season 1 of Daredevil, though this fell through since he was tapped to direct the doomed film The Sinister Six for Sony's universe of Marvel films, a project that would have tied into Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man and would have been part of the Sony's universe of Spider-Man characters, or whatever it ended up being called, before that was canned in favor of rebooting with Tom Holland and making the Sony universe of Spider-Man characters its own thing. Stephen S. DeKnight took over for him, having had worked on the Superman show Smallville pretty significantly, and showrunning the show Spartacus before this show came to be. The first season isn't really an adaptation of any single comic line, rather taking a group of comic elements and making a world from scratch, hoping to tackle the origin and the dynamic Kingpin and Daredevil have, along with establishing the Defenders corner of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, rather than focusing on a single story. The show was primarily shot on location in New York, though notably not much was actually shot in Hell's Kitchen proper. This was combined with shooting on stages quite a bit as well to create the vibe of Hell's Kitchen. The show had light ties to the MCU, with minor mentions of the Battle of New York as seen in the Avengers and some references to Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., but for the most part is confined to its own area of the world, doing a good job of not stepping on any toes and kind of taking only what it needed from the other shows and films in this shared universe. The show shows Matt Murdock's journey to go from a lawyer with a new practice and an unorganized vigilante to a full-blown superhero that uses the law to take down the Kingpin, who also goes on a journey from a struggling criminal Kingpin to the threat we know from the comics. Karen Page, a young woman, kicks off the plot, being caught in a conspiracy where she is framed of a crime supposedly killing her co-worker at Union Allied, though this is eventually proven false, with the mystery of who was behind it all being up in the air. Though she was attacked by a hitman and saved by Daredevil, while James Wesley covers up the crime by blackmailing a dirty cop. Karen also at this time meets Ben Urich, who is an uncorruptible, honest journalist. Karen gets to help with the case despite his reluctance. Karen joins Matt and his partner Foggy Nelson at their defense attorney practice, Nelson and Murdock, where they're defending innocent people from being arrested on false or unfair charges primarily. Matt hears a boy being kidnapped but is badly beaten when he was on the trail, and meets a woman, Claire Temple, who patches him up and agrees not to disclose his identity, being supportive of Matt, but worrying about his crusade. Matt and Claire, however, were followed by a Russian hitman, who Matt beats into telling him where the kidnapped boy is, and after a fight, he saves him, with Matt gaining a new ally in Claire. Eventually, Wesley hires Nelson and Murdock to defend one of Kingpin's hitmen, hoping to add them to the Fisk payroll, and Matt and Foggy reluctantly agree, mostly in hopes of figuring out who is behind all these issues in Hell's Kitchen. Karen is also bribed to keep quiet, as the shell company Union Allied will sue her if she isn't. She goes to Ben, who is still reluctant to join the cause and is extra hesitant since his publisher really doesn't want anything to do with what is happening in Hell's Kitchen, figuring crime stories don't do much to help the city and that fluff is all people want to read these days. The pair get Fisk's man out of charges, but Matt interrogates him as Daredevil, hoping to learn more information. He does give some information up, though he commits suicide knowing the consequences he faces for betraying Fisk. Matt starts searching for this Wilson Fisk guy, but ends up with nothing, while Wesley yells at the Russians for failing to produce results, causing tension in their organization. The Russians visit the assassin that attempted to kill Matt and Claire, and he tells them of the masked vigilante, and Claire, hoping to get the vigilante, they go after Claire, but she gets a hold of Matt before she's kidnapped. Matt shows up in the mask and defeats the gang, which leads Fisk to angrily kill one of the Russians, since the whole thing interrupted his first date with his new lover Vanessa, who he recently met. With all this happening, Fisk's benefactor from Japan, Gao, shows up asking what the hell is happening, and Elena, a local renter, starts hoping to speak out about the rental company she rents from, which is treating the residents unfairly, to Matt and Foggy. As it turns out, the rental company is under Wilson Fisk. The renters are also being kicked from their homes for a settlement, and Elena refuses to move and take the money despite it being the safest option for her. Soon, Fisk betrays his Russian allies, which causes a gang war that kills many of Vladimir's men, though Vladimir survives, looking for revenge for his brother, who was previously killed by Fisk. Corrupt police surround Vladimir and Daredevil, who is by now on site, but Daredevil protects him, and a large part of Hell's Kitchen is bombed, which is blamed on Daredevil after Fisk kills some police that also gets blamed on him. Vladimir ends up telling Daredevil of Leland, Fisk's accountant, before himself dying to save Daredevil, seeing it as his only chance at stopping Fisk at this point. Before Daredevil can find this accountant, though, Stick comes to town, the man who trained Daredevil as a child, who is on his own missions in Hell's Kitchen against Mao, and a weapon called the Black Sky. Stick agrees not to kill, but he kills Black Sky, who is actually a young kid, which angers Daredevil, causing Matt to lash out against his mentor. While this is happening, though, Ben finally gets convinced to investigate Fisk, but says the evidence needs to be airtight to try to take down such a powerful and reclusive man. This alliance is still fairly young when Karen is attacked by some of Fisk's men, but is saved by Daredevil. Karen tells Matt her plan, and Matt tells Karen to be more careful since events are clearly escalating in Hell's Kitchen. Fisk, however, realizes stuff is getting out of control, going to Mao, who tells him he needs to basically nut up and get everything in order, or the whole operation will go to shambles. Fisk makes the daring decision to go public on the behest of Vanessa, pretending to be a philanthropist, trying to fix Hell's Kitchen. Matt goes to gain information on Fisk by visiting Vanessa and meets Fisk for the first time, who is suspicious of him. Meanwhile, Fisk brings in assassin Nobu, who confronts Daredevil, but the assassin ends up burning to death after a battle, though in the process Matt is seriously injured and Claire again tends to his wounds, though this is when Foggy shows up and finds out Matt is secretly Daredevil, questioning everything he's ever known about his best friend, briefly breaking up the Nelson and Murdoch company while Foggy processes what he learned. Karen, meanwhile, is still investigating everything, meeting Fisk's mom, who revealed to Karen that Fisk killed his dad years earlier when he was young to defend her, and kind of making him less sensitive to death, learning from his father's failures that he needs to step on heads to make it to the top, as the man he killed always dreamed of doing. Fisk holds a gala, but the drinks are poisoned, killing a few attendees and putting Vanessa into a coma. Claire leaves Matt, telling him to chill, as Matt is healing up. Matt then finds a man who makes Fisk's armor and asks him to make a superhero costume for him that he figured would be ready in time for the final dramatic battle of the season. He was correct on this point. Wesley finds out what Karen did visiting Fisk's mom and runs to confront her before his grieving boss can find out. He tries killing Paige, but fails when Paige grabs the gun and shoots him after a struggle. Matt manages to topple some of Gao's heroin operations, which leads her to head back to Japan, as things were getting too hot in New York at that time. Vanessa wakes up and refuses to leave the country as Fisk requests, saying she'll stick by his side as Fisk begins wondering where Wesley is, finding out he's been assassinated, which angers the mob boss. Ben is fired when trying to present the story of Fisk, as he learned from Karen, accusing his boss of being paid by Fisk, which leads to his firing and him trying to drop the article independently. But before he can do this, Fisk kills him after meeting up in his apartment. Nelson and Murdoch come back together following Ben's death, as Fisk learns his accountant and Gao poisoned Vanessa at the party, hoping to kill Vanessa, seeing her as a distraction for Fisk, causing issues within the crime organization. Fisk kills his accountant in anger, despite the fact that Owsley, the accountant, had evidence and a witness stored away in the event that he was killed. Meanwhile, Matt and Foggy learn the same thing when they overhear some corrupt cops mention as much at the police station, making it a race to save the witness who could ruin Fisk's empire. Matt saves the witness and arrests are made, grabbing many of the corrupt citizens and officials throughout Hell's Kitchen, including Fisk himself. Though Vanessa, in one last Hail Mary attempt, calls in some people to save Fisk as he's transported to jail. Daredevil catches up to him in his new flashy costume, and after a fight, manages to beat the crime boss and save Hell's Kitchen, re-establishing Nelson and Murdoch and officially taking the name Daredevil in his transition from vigilante to superhero of Hell's Kitchen. Matt Murdock, or Daredevil, premieres here and is a mainstay hero on the street level of the Marvel Universe, being a blind vigilante that tries fighting crime from the streets and defending the innocent as a defense attorney by day. He first appeared in Daredevil #1 from 1964 and has been fairly popular as a hero ever since. The adaptation fairly accurately captures his early years as a crime fighter before the other side characters like Elektra and Bullseye enter the fold, and people typically really like Charlie Cox's version, at least more than the previous Ben Affleck version from 2004. Karen Page first appeared along with Daredevil in Daredevil #1 as his first love interest. She would eventually become redundant with the rise of Elektra being his true love interest. So then the comics decided to make her a porno actress that was addicted to heroin, and then they killed her off after getting hit with a staff by Bullseye. I think cutting some of her story was probably for the best on this one, and she's a pretty good character in this show. She kind of had the old Marvel treatment of weird ideas editors just said, yeah, sure, why not to? Kind of a weird one. Foggy is Daredevil's best friend and partner, also part of his main cast pretty much for his entire history. First appearing in Daredevil #1, he is pretty much unchanged from the comics and is a solid adaptation of the guy who works with Daredevil in the courts and supports and worries about Matt when he's in his Daredevil alter ego. James Wesley in the comics is one of Kingpin's top lawyers who worked with him till a nuke went off in Hell's Kitchen, at which time he bounced. Here he's the spokesperson for Fisk, carrying out his orders and being something of the middleman between Fisk and his lackeys. He first appeared in Daredevil 227 from 1985 and was quite different, but I quite like Wesley in this show, and his dynamic with Fisk is really good. Ben Urich is a reporter in the comics, first appearing in Daredevil 153 from 1978, and from there he would work at all the major papers, being a trustworthy guy and working with people across the Marvel Universe, even beyond just Daredevil. In the comics he's still alive, but his nephew Philip Urich was the second Green Goblin, eventually the Hobgoblin and Goblin King, somehow just kind of being tied into that Goblin legacy, somewhat separated from Ben, but that's kind of how the Marvel Universe works sometimes. Kingpin, or Wilson Fisk, is a startup mobster new to the top, still very prone to mistakes and hesitation. Wilson Fisk first appeared in Amazing Spider-Man 50 and is sort of New York's big crime boss, or in layman's terms, the Thanos of the Hood. He is known for running numerous rackets in the Marvel Universe, fighting basically anyone and working with criminals of all kinds. I would say if I had to put him in a box, he's mostly a shared Spider-Man Daredevil villain, but Iron Fist, Luke Cage, and even Moon Knight have crossed paths with him here and there. Vanessa Fisk is Wilson Fisk's wife and confidant, working with the villain and knowing what's up, but keeping away from the action, so to speak. She originated in Amazing Spider-Man 70, before a full appearance in Amazing Spider-Man 83 later on. Stick first appeared in Daredevil 176, and much like in this show, is a blind ninja that taught Matt how to hone his senses and eventually become a ninja man vigilante like himself. Given their similar situation, he was a suitable mentor for the hero and also had ties to the Fist, which was a unit designed to fight the Hand. Of course, his importance only compounds as the Defenders saga goes on, but he's pretty on target. Also, the Fist is the inspiration for the Foot Clan in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Just a fun fact there for you. Claire Temple is here and acts as sort of the Defenders' Nick Fury, more of a support character than a leader, but working with the Defenders to patch them up and help them when they're in need of help. She first appeared in Hero for Hire 2 from 1972, which was the series that followed the stories of Luke Cage, and was married to Ant-Man supporting character Bill Foster, or Goliath. Her character is similar here to the comics, but she, in the show, has some romantic chemistry with Daredevil, and in the MCU, never actually meets Bill Foster, being totally separate from that connection, with Lawrence Fishburne's Bill Foster just kind of doing his own thing in the Ant-Man films. Matt Murdock, or Daredevil, is our show's lead and titular character, who's kind of caught between the bureaucracy and finality of the court system versus the quickness and danger of his vigilante life, making a strong contrast between the two. Matt, when he isn't Daredevil, is soft-spoken, quaint, and tries to spell out the reality of the situation, which is odd considering his double life is quite different. Daredevil at this point in his life feels like an outlet for anger rather than a tool to save people solely. Matt is fine, meticulously working within the system by day, but at night he cheats a bit to get where he wants under the mask as the ruthless Daredevil. This moment we saw in Matt's life is right when he starts out as Daredevil and is starting his practice, a mirror to Kingpin, who recently worked his way to the top of crime in Hell's Kitchen. This means we have Matt at a turning point where he can kind of use Daredevil for deadly means or as a tool to hold the corrupt accountable, with the only small anchors he has in the suit to humanity being Claire, Foggy, and Karen. He has a vendetta against Fisk that starts out as an outsider, but grows more urgent as he grows closer to Karen and those affected directly with Fisk's crimes. He is also in way over his head, coming close to death more than once in this show, with Claire basically telling him at some point he isn't going to survive. Matt and Foggy's friendship is tested when Foggy finds out about Daredevil, not knowing what else Matt is hiding, though the two are able to continue their friendship, albeit in a slightly different capacity, as Foggy understands Matt's perspective, though not really approving of it. Karen Page was an innocent bystander that gets pulled into this life when she was working as a bookkeeper for Union Allied, a company that Fisk was using as one of his many fronts. She stumbled into information that Fisk thought was valuable, so they had her framed for a crime. Matt and Foggy get to her though, and she joins them as their assistant intern thing, while in the background looking to solve this crime, using her own tactics, working with Ben Urich, mostly behind Foggy and Matt's back. In a way endangering herself like Daredevil is, but not in the same way. Karen feels immense guilt late in the show as Ben ends up sacrificing himself to keep Karen out of the investigation that he was doing with her as a means to keep the Kingpin off her back. Ben's death affected everyone, but it affected Karen most, in part because that could have been her just as easily, and because this whole path was followed largely because of what happened to her. On top of that, she also killed James Wesley, Kingpin's assistant, who underestimated her. She was forced into this new life, but after all she saw and had to do, she becomes hellbent on working with Matt and Foggy in the future to continue to make a difference even beyond the stories that directly impact her. Foggy is the comic relief, and while Karen and Matt are living double lives, he just is kinda there. Well, that's an under-exaggeration, but Foggy's goals are to help the firm and get it off the ground while helping his friends on their less than profitable quests to foil the Kingpin. This isn't to say Foggy isn't supportive, but at times he's frustrated since he feels everyone's withholding information from him when he's on the team with Karen and Matt, climaxing with him discovering Matt is Daredevil, a fact he almost can't process and almost leads to the group's disbandment and the fall of the newly created Nelson and Murdoch. Ultimately, Foggy stands by his friend, but is still skeptical about what Matt is doing, and becomes pretty integral at the climax of the show in helping to take Kingpin down, working with one of his ex-girlfriends to get information that is pretty viable in taking down the crime lord. James Wesley is sort of a dark Foggy Nelson, being Kingpin's assistant, and the closest thing the evil gang leader has to a friend and unshakable ally. Wesley does unspeakable things at the command of the Kingpin, and until Fisk steps out of the shadows following Wesley's death, is sort of the messenger and face of this growing gang operation that runs human trafficking, drugs, and other rackets in Hell's Kitchen and New York at large. He ends up underestimating Karen, letting his guard down, which leads to him being killed, a death that profoundly affects Kingpin in the process and leads to his arc that ends the show on a more ruthless Kingpin than we saw at the start. Kingpin is the final character, and Wilson Fisk is kind of a dark mirror to Daredevil, as Wesley is Foggy, with him in ways going through the opposite arc to Daredevil. or at least one with some overlap. Early on in this escalating battle between Kingpin and Daredevil, he meets Vanessa, the first person he can connect with, on a deeper level, following the death of his father, killed by his own hand following his dad abusing his mom, which seemingly had his dad's final message ingrained in him, which is more or less that life is unfair, and that the only way to get what you want is to take it for yourself. Vanessa starts showing some compassion to this gang leader, something that his associates like Mao do not like, since it shows he has some weakness. If she was to be captured, he would do anything to save her, for example. This leads to Owsley, his financial expert, to team up with Mao to get her out of the way with poison, though she's saved, leading to the Kingpin killing Owsley, which causes Owsley's insurance, a thought-dead informant, to spill his information to the cops, leading to the climax of the show. Kingpin shows emotion twice, really. Once when Vanessa is almost assassinated, and once when Wesley is assassinated, losing one of the 3 people he cares for, along with his near-vegetable mother. Moments like these make you kind of feel for Kingpin, while moments like him killing Urich make you reviled by the villain. Ultimately, Kingpin has a choice to go all in or get out when confronted with the whole truth by Owsley, who he kills brutally, which also leads to him being arrested, and by the end of the show we can tell that next time we see Kingpin, he's going to be much more ruthless than before in protecting the ones he loves. This show has a very dark tone, not too dissimilar to something like the Dark Knight trilogy, both of which largely pulled from Frank Miller's work for inspiration, making the grittier feel not all that surprising, though also factoring in some real-life issues like mob killing, human trafficking, drugs, and even having a hero who's basically living on a ticking clock. It's pretty dark, especially when you factor in the fact that this is part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, with even the other shows intended to be in this universe, decanonized or not at this point, like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., mostly sticking to a tone that's very Marvel Cinematic Universe-esque. I mean, even The Winter Soldier, which is considered one of the more grounded and dark films, wouldn't have a scene where Kingpin smashes a dude's head in with a door for like 3 straight minutes. It shows that the MCU faces many of the same problems as we do in the real world, on top of dealing with your Ultrons and Thanoses. I also think this is kind of the right move, since TV superhero shows are hard. You can make something adequate like the Arrowverse with these characters, but there will always be a level of cheesiness trying to do big characters like Anti-Monitor or Doomsday on TV, which is bound to look worse on a shoestring budget than a guy in a costume beating the shit out of a guy in a tuxedo. Much of this show is a crime drama rather than an action show alone, which is a smart way to use the budget, since those occasional action set pieces look really good, and like they have quite a bit of budget behind them. And it's padded out with some really interesting exposition, investigation, and other things that keep the show interesting, despite the lack of moment-to-moment fight action that you may expect in something like an MCU film, which has a set piece every 10 minutes. Musically, the show is fairly ambient, but I dig the theme song by John Paisano. It's definitely one of those light songs, and Daredevil is never seen flipping into some larger-than-life John Williams score or something, but that was sort of the point, and with the general tone, ambient, I think, was the way to go. This isn't a big screen spectacle after all, this is a relatively small-scale crime drama. Jonathan Chimble did the editing work on a lot of the Marvel Netflix shows as the lead, but he's also worked in other editorial departments over the years. The editing is good, but honestly I wouldn't have hated this show being slimmed down to like 9 episodes. A few of the episodes just felt like they spin their wheels a bit, and I think it could have been tighter, though Netflix seems to have ordered 13 50-minute episodes as a standard for all these shows. Nowadays, I think the pressure is off for episode lengths and even episode counts, which I think is something that kind of got revolutionized by Disney+. But even 5 or 6 years ago, before streaming sort of became the standard rather than a rising industry, it seemed shows being more formatted was a thing, trying to kind of emulate cable TV, leading the production crew to add more stuff to the show than I think was really necessary. I don't think it's all that much of a hindrance though, and I still enjoyed all the episodes. It's more of a preference thing because honestly I think the show is really solid, and I just saw moments that I think could have been trimmed, and I think for like further rewatches. It'd be nice if it was just like a more concise 8 or 9 episodes. Might just be me though. The cinematography for the show was done by Matthew J. Lloyd, who shot as the lead cinematographer for all 13 episodes. And I think for a TV show, it looks really good, and the masks and the cheaper effects work in the darkness, while also being really easy to decipher what's happening. The contrast between Matt walking in the streets during the day versus Daredevil at night is very clear, not to mention some special locales like Daredevil's hallway fight, which was 100% ripped off from Old Boy, but shit, there's worse things to be inspired by than Old Boy. That's an amazing movie. Matthew Lloyd hadn't worked a whole ton before this, with his first major production being Cop Car with John Watts, who would conveniently go on to direct the Spider-Man films for the Marvel Cinematic Universe, conveniently letting Matthew J. Lloyd do the cinematography on Spider-Man Far From Home for the main MCU down the line. Well, technically it's a Sony co-production, but close enough. That said, he would also do the Defenders miniseries, though the cinematographer mostly sticks to premium streaming TV series these days and doesn't do a ton in feature films. This shows a real mix of tones, which I think is almost perfectly captured in its villain, and despite this series being a loose spin-off of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Kingpin might actually be my favorite villain in the whole universe. Kingpin is a constant contradiction, nervous and shy, loud and commanding, brutal and gentle, noble and despicable. To his mother, Vanessa and Wesley, he's polite, initially shy next to Vanessa, and endlessly loyal to all three of these people. To anyone else, however, he's brutal, beheading the Russian Vladimir and beating down a nameless henchman for not saving Wesley from his fate, despite Wesley personally telling the man to step down, as he confronted Karen alone, a fact that Kingpin knows very well. It was a miscalculation on Wesley's part that didn't account for the fact that he and his boss underestimated the lone accountant, not the fault of the henchman at all, and it's still pretty brutal. He isn't afraid to kill, trample, and maim anyone in search of his goals, and to protect his incredibly small personal circle. I kind of recap all this to say that much like the villain, the tone of this show is occasionally fun, occasionally dark, and this masterful mixing of genres makes the first season of this show something very special. I kind of appreciate that the show doesn't just immediately fit Daredevil with some dramatic supersuit. Not till the finale does he actually get one. And that's even explained as he saves the guy who armors the Kingpin's suits, some sort of special tactical tailor. Works out. Matt Murdock isn't Tony Stark. He can't just make one as a blind man with limited funds. He also doesn't have an organization like S.H.I.E.L.D. behind him who has super tailors, presumably, that make Captain America's suits every day or whatever. There's also pretty cool ways the show shows the audience blind vision, I guess, with loud heartbeats and stuff. It's more subtle than the one from Ben Affleck's film, but it's pretty neat though. I wouldn't have minded seeing the effect a few times more. Two things I'll complain about though: the Foley in this show kinda sucks honestly throughout, but the fight scenes are impressive. I just found it timed out weird sometimes and just be like common effects that I've heard in other shows and stuff. And also the show has this motif where Kingpin would look out at a plain white wall in his bedroom to kind of drown out the abuse his dad put him through. He ends up buying a painting that is white heavy from Vanessa since it evokes the same feeling at the end in prison, and it shows Kingpin staring at the prison wall, which also looks white like his bedroom wall in the painting. It's kind of a neat thematic through line that brings anger out in the villain and gives him strength through the void and emptiness, and it's a perfect ending shot for the show too. Though this is where my complaint comes in, because then, seemingly at the behest of someone who worked on the show has the single cheesiest superhero using their powers for no reason one last time scene ending. Like, we don't need some sort of like monologue and flip off a building. The ending was perfect with Kingpin just looking at the white wall. We all got it if you're paying any attention to the show. So to add this for some reason just kind of sucked, and it was just incredibly cheesy and wasn't that dramatic. Like, this doesn't need to happen all the time. It kind of reminded me of the ending of Madam Web when Dakota Johnson is in a wheelchair and blind and all the other girls in shitty Spider-Man costumes are posing with her while she like talks about how the world is going to be safe now with this group of spider women. It's typically an okay trope. I don't really mind it in some things like the Raimi Spider-Man films, but if you have a solid final shot in mind, don't ruin it with one of these, especially when the sequence doesn't stick the landing and just kind of looks hokey. If they didn't really have a perfect ending shot, I would kind of give it a pass, but the fact that they ended the show on a perfect shot and then just had to add this in for no reason, adding nothing to the plot or the show, just irks me endlessly. Overall, Daredevil Season 1 is really good. It's a really good season of TV, establishing perhaps the best villain in the MCU, despite only sort of actually being part of an MCU project at this time. The cinematography is nice, the main cast, Matt, Foggy, Karen, and Ben, are great. It's just a really good prestige crime drama with some kicking, punching superhero action mixed in. I think it is an interesting little pocket of the Marvel Cinematic Universe that is a little less laughs and fantasy and a little more real problems we may see in our world, with an underprepared discount superhero at the center. It's great. This wouldn't be the end for Daredevil though, as he'd go on to have 2 more seasons on Netflix, with this show and the New Defenders saga being a hit on Netflix at the time. One estimate puts Daredevil as having around 10% or 4.4 million viewers in the first 2 weeks after the show's release, though especially at the time the estimate was more of an approximate estimate based on survey numbers, so only Netflix could really give us exact figures. Out of 73 reviews on Rotten Tomatoes, the show has a 99% approval from critics, with Metacritic awarding it a 75 out of 100. It was nominated for several awards, but at this time, streaming TV had a weird time being recognized at TV award shows, though notably it won the Helen Keller Achievement Award for blind advocacy. I guess. I'm sure it meets the criteria of blind advocacy, so good job.